It's been a hot minute, as the kids say, since I've done this, but the time has come again to answer the age-old question, 8GB versus 16GB. I wish these two MacBook Airs were different colours. It's hard to believe that two numbers have defined my career as a tech content creator. They are 8 or 16, and that's the name of my podcast, funnily enough. This is all because in 2020, Apple introduced Apple Silicon, and they just changed everything that we knew about memory in particular. So 8GB of RAM, which it's not even called RAM anymore. Apple calls it unified memory. Even 8GB of RAM, which we used to think was not very much, suddenly became enough for a lot of people. That hasn't stopped the arrogance when it comes to memory. I've had people tell me that it's criminal for Apple to put 8GB of unified memory into a modern laptop. No, really, and I can confirm it's not a criminal offence. But it does create a lot of buying confusion, because should you go for the 8GB version or the 16GB version, I promise these are different. It's a really hard question, because on the one hand, you don't want to buy too little. You don't want to end up with a MacBook Air that doesn't work properly in 2, 3, 4 years' time. And equally, you don't want a MacBook Air that you lose loads of money on. But on the other hand, you don't want to spend money on something you're not going to use. Now, I've been using an 8GB MacBook Air since the start of this business. I use it for everything apart from production, so I don't use it for video editing and that kind of thing. For everything else, that is my main machine. And it's never caused me a problem. I've not run into the out of memory message. It hasn't landed me in jail, because it's not a criminal offence to have 8GB of unified memory in your Mac. And my SSDs are absolutely fine. This whole thing about swapping, ooh, if you go for 8GB of unified memory, the swappage is going to kill your laptop. It doesn't. However, you're watching this video because you can't decide between the 8GB and the 16GB M3 MacBook Air, and I'm going to help you make that decision. But first, a very quick word from today's sponsor, which is RoboForm. Put simply, I've never found a password manager that offers this much value for such little investment. It is so affordable. And if you've never used a password manager before, if you have all of your passwords stored in a document somewhere, or even worse, written down on post-it notes and things, please don't do that. A password manager is this vault where you can stick all of your stuff, all of your login details, your secret notes that you don't want anyone to see. Anything you hold dear that is digital, you can put into RoboForm, and it is completely safe. And they have a no breach history, which is all you need to know. And it's cross-platform, which for me is incredibly useful. I can have it on my Mac, on my S24 Ultra, on my iPad, on any Windows machine I have to get in and review. They also have this fantastic one-click login feature, which does exactly what it says on the tin. One click and you're into your favorite website or web app immediately. You can also share login details, so if you have a family member or a colleague who needs to get into something that only you have access to, RoboForm lets you do that completely securely. There's also an emergency access feature, so if something goes wrong and you can't get into your stuff, you'll have someone who you've pre-approved to be able to get in on your behalf. And if anything goes wrong with RoboForm, which it never has since I've started using it, they do have full 24/7 support. And the best news is, even though it's incredibly affordable anyway, I've worked with RoboForm to get you a very good discount. Just click that link below. Let's very quickly talk about why 8 versus 16GB of unified memory matters, because there's still a lot of confusion about this. Basically, unified memory is very different to the RAM that you might be used to in your Intel MacBook or your Windows laptop. I won't go into the details because I don't fully understand it, but we do know that unified memory is more efficient, and it gives you more, basically, for less. Although this isn't an exact science, 8GB of unified memory is much more in terms of performance and headroom than 8GB of RAM in the Intel days. It just is, and my experience of using an 8GB MacBook Air behind the scenes in this business for nearly 4 years proves that. But the buying decision is still very tricky, and I think the reason for that is that people hold on to their MacBook Airs for a long time. If you go to a coffee shop today, I can guarantee there'll be 1 or 2 people sitting there with a MacBook that has, oh, do you remember this? That used to light up. They'll be sitting there with their coffee, quite happily using their Intel MacBook Air that has an illuminated Apple logo. And bearing that in mind, when you buy a new MacBook Air, when you go into the Apple Silicon era, the chances are that new laptop will need to last you just as long. And also, if you don't choose enough unified memory, it can result in a frustrating user experience depending on what you do with your laptop. And let's not beat around the bush, 200 quid or $200, which is what Apple charges for the upgrade from 8 to 16, is a lot of money. And that's why a lot of people just think, nah, I'll throw caution to the wind. People like Mark Ellis keep saying that 8 gig is fine. I'm not spending that extra 200 quid. So to put my own theory to the test, I have been running a little test. A few weeks ago, Apple sent me the 16 gig M3 MacBook Air. I can't remember which one it is. They sent me the same colour as the one that I've got already. So basically, one of these is the M2 MacBook Air. It's the base model. It's mine. It's got 8 gig of unified memory, and I use it every single day. The other one is this 16 gig M3 MacBook Air. It's the new one. And I thought, I wonder what would happen if I started using the 16 gig M3 version instead of my trusty 8 gig M2 version, and if I didn't change anything that I do with it, if I just do my normal everyday tasks, will I notice any difference? And I've written down the stuff that I do with my MacBook Air: email, writing, Zoom calls, Slack, web browsing. That's it. Have I noticed a difference? Not really. The M3 version, the 16 gig one, might be a little bit snappier, but I'm not sure if that's just a placebo effect. In fact, the only area where the 16 gig M3 MacBook Air did feel better than the 8 gig M2 version was when I was viewing ad-heavy websites. So I do a lot of that in this game. I have to read a lot of websites that have a lot of ads on them because I read the news and all that sort of stuff. Now, on the 8 gig M2 version, which is one of these, those websites, when viewed in Safari, completely kill that laptop. That doesn't happen on the 16 gig M3 version. I'm also acutely aware that the M3 version should be a good stand-in for video editing duties if something went catastrophically wrong with my expensive MacBook Pro. But do either of those things suggest that I did the wrong thing going for the 8 gig version? No. Okay, so who is the 8 gig M3 MacBook Air for? Remember my use case: email, writing, zooming, slacking, and other very simple stuff, web browsing, etc, etc. If that matches your use case and your budget will not stretch any further than the 8 gig M3 MacBook Air, be that the 13-inch or the 15-inch version, just go for it. Equally, if you don't care too much about resale value and you've accepted the fact that as macOS gets better and the app universe expands and improves, your 8 gigabyte MacBook Air might get a bit slower in the future. If that's the way you think, that's absolutely fine. I don't blame you. Don't let anyone tell you any differently. But if that's you, just get the 8 gig version. I think it's great for bulk buying as well. So if you've got a team full of people who need a new MacBook and their use case matches the one that I've just described, and you don't want to blow your budget, just get the 8 gig one. And there's something else very exciting about the base model M3 MacBook Air, which I'll come on to after we've tackled the 16 gig version. Although I think there's a massive market for that base model M3 MacBook Air, I think the majority of people will go for the 16 gig version. I just think even though it's 200 quid, $200 for that upgrade, what you get back for that investment is huge because it gives you peace of mind, and the fact that you're watching this video and you've got this far in it means that you're really trying to work out whether you should spend that money. And if you're trying to work that out, you must have that money. And even now with Apple Silicon, the best money you can spend on upgrades is memory, because it means you'll have that headroom that you might need one day. It means that it will last longer and be faster for longer, and the resale value should be better. So my rule with this is that if you are asking yourself the question, should I go for 16 gig? I've got the money there, I can spend it if I need to, just do it. Because the worst thing you could do is go for the 8 gig version because I've said you don't need anything more, and then it turns up and you think, I should have bought that 16 gig one. I don't want you to feel like that. If you can afford it, I think the sweet spot spec for the M3 MacBook Air is the 16 gig version with the 1 terabyte of storage. In the UK, that comes in at £1,699 for the 13-inch version and £1,899 for the 15-inch version. Yes, these are still very expensive laptops, but they just are. They're MacBooks and they last ages. They're built fantastically. They are incredibly fast. They are worth that money. But there is one other question that you might have, which is, should you go for the M2 or the M3 MacBook Air? So at the moment, the M2 MacBook Air is the base model. It's the cheapest one you can get. It's been relegated to that kind of, this is the starting point type thing. The problem with that MacBook is that if you go for the base model, it has one NAND chip. This relates to the storage, and it was a departure from the M1 version, which had 2 NAND chips. It just meant that in certain scenarios, and certainly with certain benchmarks, the M2, the base model M2 MacBook Air, was slower than the M1 version. Now the good news is the base model M3 MacBook Air has 2 NAND chips. Yeah! But that also means that the M2 version isn't worth buying. And that's because the M3 version has those 2 NAND chips, but it also has better Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi 6E, and the ability to drive 2 external monitors when you've closed the lid. Trust me, the M3 is the way to go. In conclusion, get the base model 8GB M3 MacBook Air if your budget will not stretch any further and if you don't care about resale value. For everyone else, and I think this is a bigger portion of the market, get the 16GB one. And yes, there is a 24GB option as well, but as I've always said, you know if you need that. Anyway, if you want to see my full review of the M3 MacBook Air, keep watching for a link.